have a few questions, but just before we get started, am I pronouncing your name correctly, Rajiva Wijesinha?
It's Rajiva.
Rajiva.
The first syllabus, yeah.
Okay. And how should I refer to you? I mean, you used to be, I think, Secretary of SCOP, but how should I refer to you now?
Just an ordinary member of parliament.
Okay. And this is for the Liberal Party, is that right?
Liberal Party as part of the ruling government alliance.
Okay, so as part of the coalition.
It's part of the coalition, yeah.
Okay. So maybe just for some background first,
Yeah.
there's been a lot of discussion around the panel that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has set up to
Yeah.
look at alleged war crimes or abuses
Yeah.
in the last stages of the war. What's the government's response to that?
Well, I don't think it's supposed to be, according to Ban Ki-moon at least, as opposed to all the hype. It's not to look into abusers. It is to advise him on the best way of proceeding with regard to what he claims is his interpretation of the agreement he signed with the president. I think if you look at it very carefully, poor Ban Ki-moon is in a bit of a bind because there's a lot of pressure on him, obviously, to make some sort of statements about Sri Lanka. And on the whole, he'd been quite good about this, but, about not letting himself be carried away. But with all this pressure mounting, he had to find a way of doing it within the legalities of the UN Charter.
So he couldn't actually, as per the Charter, he can't set up a panel himself, but he can set up an advisory group. That's what you're saying.
Well, but of course he can't even set up an advisory group, which is tantamount to interference in internal affairs of a state, unless he can anchor it in some way on saying, well, he's got the concurrence of the state, which he patently doesn't. But what he did is he claimed, have a look at the terms of reference, that he reached an agreement with the Sri Lankan president last May. There is a statement, I don't know whether you've read it, it's a joint statement. And the very clear interpretation of that is that there should be accountability, but this is for the Sri Lankan government to pursue.
So, nevertheless, there is an advisory panel that has been set up.
Yeah.
What has been the reaction to that, given the context that you've just put?
The government thinks it's a wrong thing to have done. Do you think you could hang on 1 second?
Okay. Yep.
Yes. And in fact, I don't think you could go better than what emerged today in the main opposition party, because the leader of the opposition obviously thinks this is a good thing. But the person who's likely to take over as leader of the opposition said very clearly that he thought this was absolutely wrong.
So you would say, and the government would say, that this really is an interference in the sovereignty of Sri Lanka's affairs?
Well, I would say that it is an attempt to put a foot in the door which could be used by other interested parties to attempt to interfere. I mean, the reason I say this is that although the Secretary General said, this is only to advise him, and even though his spokesman say for that reason it doesn't matter that, they're not going to come to Sri Lanka. One member of the panel said it's extremely sad that he can't come to Sri Lanka because he can't do his job properly. So obviously some people in the panel don't quite understand the limitations that the Secretary General has tried very legalistically to put on the panel. And this is part of the problem, that people misunderstand each other all the time. It's a bit sad if the Secretary General's agents are contradicting what the Secretary General's people are saying, that they don't need to come to Sri Lanka.
Now, the protests that have been taking place over the past few days in front of the UN headquarters in Colombo, they've been described as I guess, very boisterous and as having blockaded the UN staff in there for at least the first day in which they took place. Is this reaction in tune with the public reaction, or is this really a much more, I guess, powerful or strong reaction to this issue?
Well, I don't quite know what happened yesterday. I read the reports in the papers today, which said there had been demonstration and the staff had not come out, but then it had been agreed that obviously they could leave, and they had done so reasonably safely. I think the UN has decided not to call people into work today. Certainly traffic was disrupted, but as you know, we don't have laws against demonstrations in this country. I think the general sense is, if you listened in Parliament today, as I said, some people in the opposition as well were quite sharp about the Secretary General and said, he seemed to be, in fact, as I said, this number two figure in the opposition just read out the UN Act and said he's completely against the Act. So I think there's a general consensus that the Secretary General seems to have overstepped his limits. But of course there are some people in the opposition, for instance the Marxist Party, that's backing, General Fonseca, obviously seem to think there was nothing wrong with this.
Now, the UN itself has protested against this demonstration that blockaded the office. They've protested in fairly strong terms, saying that they're in favour of, obviously, of the right to protest, but are disturbed by the fact that their staff were maybe put at risk, or at least couldn't leave their office. What's your response to that? Do you think these protests went too far?
Well, as I said, I don't quite know what happened. The paper today seemed to imply that everything had been amicably settled and that the UN staff had left. Apparently 4 people stayed on, but both papers, and I didn't read the government paper, I read the 2 independent papers, indicated that they'd stayed of their own will and then left quietly later. I mean, I think the problem we all have is we do believe in the right to demonstrate, but each of us gets very upset if we get personally inconvenienced. I mean, I felt irritated because of the traffic block today. But I suppose if demonstrations are allowed, you have to put up with these sorts of inconveniences. I think, as I said yesterday, it is Sri Lankan radio. Anything that happens has to be within the law. And as you know, the law says very clearly, you shouldn't be making life impossible for other people. But as far as I know, life hasn't been made impossible. And everything's passed off reasonably well.
Now, the Sri Lankan government has also established a commission. The correct name, if I'm not mistaken, is the Commission for Lessons Learned and Reconciliation, which is looking, I understand, at the last period of the war as well. That's been quite strongly criticised by some international governments and advocacy organisations, given some of the past records of the Commission of Inquiry, which I understand didn't actually fulfil or end up fulfilling its mandate. What do you say to the criticisms of this latest commission?
Well,